we'll just take a quick look at the solution code. So we'll look at the Java examples here. So we had the 3 exercises. Let me make this a bit bigger. So we started with the multi-topic producer. And really, this was an exercise designed to give you an idea about how you might dynamically create producers. So the key here mostly was pretty simple in terms of we just create a new producer. But one of the things you may have noticed, at least in this Java example, is to make it so that's fully asynchronous, we instead cache the completable futures and then await them we then chain them when we actually want to write messages. So this is most of the things here, is just recognizing that often that's actually an easier way to go if you want to have a full non-blocking sort of mechanism there with dynamic producers. This is more of how you might structure such a thing, which once again, very common pattern that you might see. And so between these few messages of just using the then compose method and then sending async return makes it a very clean way to write a fully asynchronous producer with a dynamically created producer. And once again, this technique of sort of using a cache, this is obviously a simple cache, but illustrates that you really don't want to recreate those producers every time. Instead, you want to make sure that you're reusing those, or potentially if you need something more sophisticated, this may become like an LRU cache, least recently used cache. And so that's mostly the extent of creating the producer. And then as we'll sort of see, the 2 consumers, which we looked at a little bit yesterday of how those work, we're going to create a consumer that's a regex consumer with this topic pattern, with our subscription name that was defined and a subscription of type exclusive. Oops, I don't know why that print line's there. And so that kind of gives you the using this message listener method as well. That is a very easy way of being able to, instead of calling receive, we instead use this message listener mechanism here. And we didn't actually talk much about this API in the training, but this message listener is another way, instead of calling receive, that you can listen to messages, and has, may work better if you want to have a model that looks more like a full push model, and versus the work queue consumer, where you can see very similar in creating a consumer. But what's important to note here is just by changing that subscription type, we then get a very different, we get those different semantics. So a different subscription type, a different subscription name. The rest of our code all looks very similar. It's just by the slight change around creating that subscription name, subscription type, we get quite a different mechanism. Likewise here with this, we use the receive async here that uses the more of the polling looking mechanism. Okay, so that was the first exercise. Any question? And then we'll look very quickly just at the scheduled message producer. And as you can see here, the producer looks much the same. We just create a producer. And sending a message, a delayed message, is very simple. We just use this deliver at. We just send this deliver at. Quite straightforward on the producer side. Versus the consumer, this is really just an example. There's nothing too different here, but this is an example of using the synchronous APIs, right? So we're not doing as much parallelism, but we have just the simple sort of synchronous APIs there. And then finally, for the final exercise, this was a bit more involved in the sense that we have we have a producer that looked much the same as before. We're just creating a very simple producer. Once again, writing those messages very simply. And then we have our flaky consumer, where, as you could kind of see here, the trick here was mostly just creating this dead letter policy and the negative ACK delivery delay. And hopefully you saw through running that this would occasionally, we would negatively ACK if the message failed. And when we failed after a certain number of times, you would have seen that come out in your dead letter consumer, just to illustrate how that dead letter handling works there. After looking at the code, any questions for anybody who was working through these exercises?